Good morning and welcome to the 6th meeting of the COVID-19 Committee in 2021. We received apologies this morning from Monica Lennon, MSP. Alec Rowley, MSP, is joining us as Monica's substitute, and can I welcome Alec to the meeting. At its meeting on the 26th of November 2020, the committee agreed to convene a citizens panel in January 2021. As a result, the COVID-19 Citizens Panel was established to discuss and respond to the following question. What priorities should shape the Scottish Government's approach to COVID-19 restrictions and strategy in 2021? The panel comprised of 19 individuals who were broadly representative of Scotland's population. The panel met virtually over 4 Saturdays in January and February 2021, and their report was published this morning. We will be taking evidence from representatives of the panel about their recommendations, and could I please therefore welcome Joe Eidesmont, Neil Hunter, Alan Perris, Roland Reid and Christine Watkins. I will welcome you all to the meeting and thank you for the great work that the panel has produced. We all understand that you have given up a lot of time to take part in this panel and to produce your recommendations, and they will be very useful in informing our scrutiny of the Scottish Government's response to COVID-19. We intend to use the report and your evidence today in a future session with the Scottish Government, and the clerks will provide you with details of that in due course. Now, I wonder if we could please start with a short opening remark from each of our panellists. And Joe, could we please start with you?
Good morning. Thank you for having us here. Being part of this panel has been so rewarding, fascinating. I'm really proud of the recommendations that we agreed to and the report that's been submitted. We've all lived through this year, which has been so difficult, and at times, certainly on my part, it's felt like the public has been powerless, voiceless over the decisions that have come to rule our day-to-day existence. Being part of this panel gave us an opportunity to have a really deep understanding of the data behind the decision-making, a window into the range of opinion that the government has to deal with. And I think we all came away with a solid understanding, really, of why the government has made the decisions that it has had to so far, and what you all grapple with so regularly. One of the things about it actually really was that it was quite moving to see how the pandemic has affected everyone on the panel. We've all had our different experiences, obviously. We've had furloughs, we've had redundancies, we've had loss of loved ones. And being separate from other people for so long, when we all came together, we could share those stories just a little bit, and it was actually very sobering. But it brought the group together, I think, with a really strong sense of purpose. I think that was a really moving part of it. I think it's so important that people like us are given access to our government, and that platforms like this exist so that we can play an active part in democracy. I want to be really clear, and especially for people who might consider doing something like this in the future, that this has never felt like a tick box exercise. At every single step, we felt listened to, we felt respected, our opinions were never set aside. They were central to everything that we did. And the recommendations and report really feel like they might be a key part of what happens next. And I'm sure I can speak for the panel when I say that that's how we felt. And just finally, I feel like we're at a really key point in the pandemic. We've got vaccine rollout moving forward at pace, but I think that really is battling now against some of our human natures to be with our family and friends again, and our colleagues after so long. That's why I think how the government communicates what happens next is so important. That's why our report makes recommendations which will seek to eliminate COVID as much as possible from our society, so that we can address the other elements of society that have had to take a back seat for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was very helpful. And can I turn next to Neil to make a brief opening statement?
Good morning, committee. Thanks for having me here. I would just like to say and agree with everything Joe has said. What I came away with was our shared experiences. Really, the whole panel was sort of broadly taken from across the population. We all had different shared experiences. Everything added into this process of this report. And I think those shared experiences have really got down to sometimes the crux of the matter with the recommendations. I can't really say much more about that. I mean, we had, as I said, the shared experience of us all. It did bring it home how difficult these decisions have been for the politicians and the governments involved. And as I said, every one of us had different life experiences with this COVID, though every one of us has experienced a lockdown. Within that lockdown, everybody had different experiences, which we all brought into the process of this report and the recommendations that concluded it. I think that's about as much as I can say, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Could we next move to Alan, please?
Yes, good morning, committee. I can only just say thank you again to Joe and Neil for what they said. I think they summed quite an awful lot of it up. For myself, I found it very intriguing, actually taking on the information from all the different witnesses. We were given ample time to study and debate all the issues that were brought along. Again, I know it's a hard job for the government to put everything together, but I think they've done it in a good way, and I hope that these recommendations that we put forward will forward the progress that we've actually made during the pandemic. You know, at this stage, can I also just say a thank you to Alistair Stoddard and all his team for the way that they've actually handled the panel. I say handled, facilitated the group. You know, they've been so helpful in what they've done. Working with the panel, I found it amazing about the passion of the younger ones. You know, they're so knowledgeable in all different topics and subjects, and to be quite honest, the younger ones were a breath of fresh air. You know, I found it interesting as well to get the honest views from some of the witnesses, like Professor Raj Bapal, the immunologist. You know, he was so honest with his opinions, and it was very interesting to listen to the study about the new variants and that sort of thing. So I'd just like to say thank you to all the witnesses for their time as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Can we next hear from Roland, please?
Good morning, convener. Thank you, committee. I don't know if I've got, but I really wanted to make 3 points. On a personal level, I haven't been directly affected by COVID, but the very first conversation I had with a panel member was quite salutary. He had lost a very close family member, and all his family had suffered from COVID. That really brought it home to me, the impact of the pandemic. One of our other panel members was a nurse, a cancer nurse, and she told us about the impact of the pandemic on her patients, and that was again very moving. The second point I want to make is that maybe looking at the panel members this morning, we perhaps very much reflect the population of Scotland. I didn't appreciate. I knew that we were an ageing population, but I didn't realise how significant that was. And my group and over 65 probably represents 66% of the Scottish population. So our area of interest is probably our own health and the rollout of vaccination. Nevertheless, I would like to stress that the panel were very aware of the impact of the pandemic on younger people, and we specifically asked for a representative from the Scottish Parliament to attend, and that was a Miss Gray, and that was really helpful for us. Finally, I would like to reiterate what the other panel members said, and that I felt it was a privilege to be involved in the panel. I think we heard from about 26 speakers, and all of them seemed really keen to give their time, and in fact often went over time to answer all our questions. So I really appreciated that. And also, I want to thank the parliamentary staff who seem to work day and night to put together the presentations and the reports between the sessions. So I'm really grateful for their commitment and, as Neil said, passion. So that really concludes what I want to say, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland. And finally, but not least, Chris Watkins, please.
From the panel have said that they've covered it very well, but certainly it was a privilege to be involved. And I found it very invigorating to be involved in discussions, given we hear so much on the TV. It was invigorating to be part of that discussion and feel you're getting involved in it. And as everybody else has said, excellent speakers. Alan mentioned the younger people who really brought some fresh air into it and came up with some very probing questions. I think some of them are working and weren't able to be here perhaps, but we weren't all of the demographic you're seeing on the screens today. There were certainly some younger people. And we had, from that wide demographic, we did have a wide range of opinions, as everybody said. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what happens next. I also would like to thank the facilitators, particularly given we had to do it on Zoom. And I think they were very creative in being able to achieve a good discussion despite the limitations of Zoom and not being there, altogether. And I think lastly, to my panel members, although there's only 5 of us here, I would like to say I felt as though I became part of a team and I was enjoying that teamwork, and I'm going to miss them. But so yeah, thank you for thank you for inviting us to be involved in this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to everyone for their observations and reflections. Interesting, that last point that Chris made about doing it virtually, I think it was a real challenge, and credit to the organisers, but also credit to all of you and the entire panel for making it work and for producing the report that you have. We're now going to move to questions. Members of the committee will have about 5 minutes each to ask questions of witnesses. So we're going to try, if we can, to keep questions and answers concise. We've got about another 45 minutes or so. I know we started late. And also I'd like to allow a bit of time at the end for any of the panel members to ask questions of the committee. And if members could indicate who they are asking their questions to, that would assist our broadcasting colleagues. And as ever, please wait a moment for your microphone to be switched on before speaking. If I could ask just one question, and I think it's probably directed to Neil, given that I think you want to cover the direct harms of COVID. Neil, one of the recommendations, or I think one of the central recommendations that the report published today makes, is that the Scottish Government should state its aims, including what it considers to be an acceptable level of infection for its strategy going forward. I just wondered if you wanted to add to that, if you had any reflections on that point and what that means to you, an acceptable level of infection might be.
Yeah, I could. That was mostly up on the strategy that the government would take on the suppression or the elimination strategy. I mean, when I think the panel came to agreement, the elimination strategy would be the far better strategy to go for. But the suppression, if we've seen in the reality though that the suppression strategy, there was going to have to be a sort of combination of the two, suppression and then elimination, and then try to work for elimination overall. But during the suppression phase, if we had a good test and trace and a good ability to close our borders, there would have to be some sort of, everybody accepted there'd be some sort of level of virus infection that we could free the population to. if we could bring it at the R number, I think everybody was talking about, really. If we could bring that down low enough, there was an acceptable level where we could allow the population to gradually come out of this lockdown process, still going forward with suppression techniques and aiming for an elimination strategy altogether.
Thank you, Neil. I think Joe would like to come in here too. Joe, could I turn to you? Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to build on what Neil said. I think some of that came from a discussion about communication strategy, and we had talked about how initially a year ago we were very much all on board with Protect the NHS, but it feels like the Scottish Government strategy might have evolved over the year to more of a saving lives strategy by getting case numbers down as low as possible. And I think there's been a bit of a disconnect because people now don't understand that that's what's required of them, and they still think, well, hang on, it said Protect the NHS, case numbers are low enough, we can open up again. And I think the new variant has had to change the strategy, and I'm not sure that that's been communicated as effectively.
Thank you both for those answers. I'm going to turn next to Alec Rowley, MSP, for his questions. Alec.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to focus on the action to mitigate the societal impacts, and specifically I would like to ask the panel, well, firstly I would like to congratulate the panel on the work that they have done. As we strive to bring democracy closer to the people, then citizens' panels and citizens' involvement is certainly one way that is favoured, and your input to that as we move forward, I think, will be really important. But can I ask specifically on the recovery? And the panel have supported a green recovery, but I wonder, what does that mean to you as panel members when we all keep saying it, we need to bounce back better with a green recovery? What does that mean to the panel, and what discussion did you have around that?
I think, Roland, if you could start, and then if others want to come in, that would help.
I think, Convener, this was quite an interesting discussion, that we were aware that the way the panel was operating with the now land as Blue Jeans, there's a different way of functioning. Panel demonstrates that there's the opportunity to work from home. That means perhaps less travelling. We were also aware of the impact that the pandemic has had on retailing, and that may change forever. So for panel members living in urban areas, one of our discussions was what's going to happen to city centres, and maybe some of the things that were happening anyway. People's interest in cycling and walking, that this is something that could be taken forward. One of our panel members, Audrey, lives in Dumfries, and that was cited as an example where the local community are looking to take over some old empty properties to revitalise the town centres. And so the importance of community involvement in this move towards a green economy, I think, is really important. That what the panel demonstrated, I think, just across the spectrum of people involved, there's a great deal of talent there, and it's a matter of encouraging and supporting that community to become active and work with others to move forward with a green recovery.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you for that. I think Chris wants to come in now, and then I'll go back to Alec.
Yeah, thanks. Just to follow on from what Roland said, I think we were looking at also that there were many sectors that perhaps there'll be a number of people who won't be able to get work in those sectors again, and we need to be looking at what what new kind of areas they could work in. And I think the green recovery gives opportunities for that, and looking at investing and promoting green recovery, maybe looking at new technologies, doing more research on tidal power, and really taking that forward. Also, importantly, that I think any new economic development, the green recovery should be incorporated into all sectors. For example, if we're looking at developing new ideas or giving people loans or looking at how we pursue the new businesses getting back on their feet, maybe we need to look at standards and requirements within that would be sustainable and encourage looking at green aspects. I mean, in further involvement in things like government-private partnerships in green technologies, and using the Green Investment Bank. I just think there's lots of opportunities, and I think whilst nobody would have wanted to be in this crisis, I think we felt that it could be a time for opportunity as well coming out of this, and really taking on board some of those green issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Alec, have you got any further questions?
I'll just go with one more to allow other people to come in. But in terms of, town centres was mentioned there, and it's certainly a part of the economy that I think, as you said, was before the pandemic, moving in a different direction. Can I ask, specifically around town centres, but more generally, did the panel hear any evidence that we might be able to rebuild safe social spaces going forward, or create new social spaces? Does the panel think that as we open up, we will be able to go back to crowded bars and crowded theatres, etc., or did they take any evidence that said that we need to look at how we interact with other people and what that will mean for town centres and for the economy? Thank you.
Chris, do you want to start, and then if anyone else wants to come in, and then we'll move on?
I don't think I've got a lot to add on what Roland said before, but I think we did say that one of the things that came out of one of the groups I was discussing in, that maybe the town centres will never look again what they looked like previously, and that if we're looking at that, we have to think much wider than retail, and we have to be much more creative in what we use our town centres for. That much more cultural things, maybe community involvement in that. And I think we should be discussing with communities how they would like to see their town centres used.
Thank you. Our next set of questions come from Stuart McMillan. Stuart.
Thank you, convener. It's the first question. Actually, it's towards Roland and Chris in particular because of their opening comments. Was there any discussion regarding timescales for the reopening of society and also the economy, bearing in mind also what happened last year? So were there any kind of lessons learned from last year and any suggestions that you would have and discussions for going forward? We'll go to Roland first.
Yeah, convener, I think what we learned was that things probably opened. Professor Debbie Schroeder made that point, citing July, August, that Scotland at that point had been doing really well and that we were on a trajectory towards elimination. But the problem at that point was the return of people from holiday, reseeding the pandemic, and also probably the premature reopening of hospitality premises as well. That had an impact, and that great achievement summer last year was then lost as the pandemic spread again. So the lesson, I think, is to be very cautious, and it might be unwise to give dates as such, that this really needs to be governed as I think Neil or Alan had said, on the R number rather than achieving a specific date. So we my other panel members may correct me, but I don't think we discussed dates at all. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Christine?
Yeah, we didn't actually discuss dates, as Roland said. I don't know that I can add much to what Roland said. I think one of the things that became clear that we was concerned that the harm caused by COVID had to be the priority factor before anything opens up, and that has to be cautious. And that perhaps the only other thing I would add to what Roland said was that we perhaps need to lock down faster if the numbers are going up. We cannot be too cautious about saying, okay, we're going to have to lock down, and that we should be looking at a regional approach again to that, so that you're not closing down economies in places where there isn't much COVID, but we can keep it within perhaps smaller areas as much as possible. I don't think I've got anything else to add to that.
Thank you. Is that really just to potentially reintroduce the tiers, the 4 different tiers that we have, or the 5 tiers we have? So to keep that, or would you want it even smaller again?
We didn't specifically speak about that. We just spoke about the need for it to be regional, so that the economy wasn't shut down for the whole country if it didn't need to be. Okay,
no, thank you. Just one other question, just regarding the harms, also which you touched upon. Like also in the report, there's a recommendation to put more resource in towards the health, into the NHS, and also one of the 4 harms is about the economy, and with people not working or being furloughed, that can have a negative effect upon people's mental health. Which then obviously has that knock-on effect upon the first of the harms. Was there any discussion around that? Because I think I generally understand the point that you were making in the report about the focus on the health element, but the economy element is also quite important as a prevention mechanism also. Go to Christine first, if I may.
I think one of my other colleagues was preparing to look at this area a bit more, so maybe they can speak on this prior to me. I've been speaking quite a bit.
Okay. Anyone in particular?
I think Joe? Alan and Joe Stewart.
Okay. Alan first.
Yeah. Could you just go through your question again? Sorry, just so I can get the main points.
Sure, no problem. It was also part of the report has discussed the point of putting more finance into the NHS to help with that particular harm. But obviously there is a knock-on effect to the economy if the economy is not working, people are on furlough. If people are on furlough or if people have been made redundant, it then has a knock-on effect upon their mental health. So it then feeds once again back into the initial aim of trying to protect the NHS. So was that type of thing discussed at all?
Yeah, I think what we discussed was the knock-on effect, and basically what we were trying to do was protect the NHS, and we were really concerned that with people who initially contracted the virus weren't using the track and trace, and they were scared of being furloughed or being sent home. One example was my own son who'd caught COVID the week before last. Generally earns £600 a week. He was told he had to furlough, and he could only claim statutory sick pay of £98 a week, which doesn't cover his food bill, electricity, mortgage and things. So that would have obviously a knock-on effect with quite a large number of the population. So the fear was that they wouldn't self-isolate, which would put a bigger burden then on the NHS itself. So those sorts of topics were actually discussed. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think Joe wanted in.
Thank you. Yeah, it was just really to reiterate, I'm just looking at the report here, and we did sort of wrestle with this a little bit, but it was more, it's not exactly an all or nothing, it's more of a balance. So we did want to focus on COVID directly because that is the way that everything else can open up, but the other three came fairly hot on the heels behind it, and it wasn't that we didn't want to put any focus on the economy, it was just the recognition that this has to come first, because really we're struggling to open anything else up if we don't.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. Our next questions come from Mark Ruskell.
Convener, and yeah, morning everybody. Fantastic work. I think we're only going to scratch the surface here this morning, but we're going to keep referring back to this work. It's great. I wanted to ask you actually, I mean, you just covered the issue there about self-isolation and some of the difficulties that people have. I wonder if there was any more sort of thoughts on that from the panel, particularly from Chris.
Sorry, on self. Can you say that again about self-isolation?
Yeah, just on self-isolation and some of the challenges that people have had around self-isolation. You got anything more to add on that?
I think we did recognise that for some people this has been incredibly challenging, and on two fronts really, on the mental health issues and financially, and we did talk about the need to support people with their mental health issues and different creative ways that can be done and is being done, and I think perhaps we discussed more being on that side. Also, we did discuss, there'd been some discussion, certainly, in government, on the news, we're hearing some discussion about the demand for a payment for people who are in self-isolation. I think, from my memory, as we discussed this, there were lots of pros and cons around that, looking at some of the challenges in able to do that, but it is something that should be explored more in particularly focused on employers, and to be able to allow employees to be away from work without losing their business because of that. And the problem with employers forcing employees to come into work, and that we should be looking at that, to look at the employers taking a responsibility and how the government can support those employers to do so.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. One of your recommendations is that, and this is perhaps more a question for Alan and possibly Joe as well, but one of your recommendations is about the need to have a ready-made plan in place if we have another pandemic, well, I guess when we have another pandemic. So I was interested in that recommendation, and who do you think should maintain that plan? So Alan, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that you want to expand.
Not really, I'm sorry. I don't know if Joe can expand on that just a little tiny bit.
Thank you, Alan. We talked about an independent oversight committee to prepare for if this should happen again, and really quickly learn the lessons that we've been learning since last year and implement them quickly. So we didn't really want to have a long period of inquiry where in a couple of years there are lessons learned. We know things now that we didn't last March, and we wanted some sort of independent committee to be able to implement those things quickly, whether that's in terms of having enough and appropriate PPE, things like that. So the reason we said should be an independent oversight committee is just to lift it out of the political and just to make sure that it's something that exists, and that's nothing to do with parliamentary terms. So that's where that came from. I don't think we had any further discussion about what the ready-made plan would consist of, because I think that probably goes out of our remit, but that was where the discussion came from, and it was a desire to have some sort of independent body that could take this on, that would just lift it out of playing politics. Yeah.
And do you think that should have a remit in terms of wider kind of pandemics then? So any kind of future SARS virus or flu, it's just like a kind of resilience committee or something that exists?
Yeah, we heard from Jason Leach, who said that this is kind of number one or number two for every government, is a pandemic. And so we should always be in a kind of pandemic ready state. So that's, I think, where that discussion probably came from.
Okay. Okay, I think that's me, convener, just now.
Thanks, Mark. I think we'll turn next to Beatrice Wishart. Beatrice.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. And can I also echo what other colleagues have said, and thank you very much for all your time and input into the panel. I think this question is probably for Chris. I noticed that I represent an island community, but I noticed that all participants lived in mainland Scotland. I mean, there's issues where islands are distinctly different, like travel, but of course there are common issues across rural areas. And I noticed the recommendation that the Scottish Government should improve connectivity broadband, but you referenced particularly for tackling isolation for young people in island and rural communities. I just wondered if you could give a bit more background onto that recommendation.
I'm struggling to remember exactly what some of that discussion. I know I live in a rural area, and we do struggle with certainly even public transport, and I know in some of the communities really struggle with broadband. I mean, the community I live in, we were very lucky that we ended up being a bit of a pilot project with BT, and they put a lot of money into getting us connected very well. But I do hear of other communities where that's a real struggle, and if we want people to be able to work at home and to also to keep young people in our communities, we need to look at that much more. I mean, I can't really think of much more. I don't think I was in the group that specifically brought that recommendation out and towards the end. Maybe one of my colleagues can add a bit more to that.
Jo, do you want to come in here?
Thank you. Just to say on the back of what Chris has said, that on day 4, the final day of the panel, we had witnesses join us who we'd requested, and we had asked for some people from islands to be part of the witnesses. So we did have, we had a student who'd come from one of the islands and was now in Dundee University, and we had another islander, and they talked us through their experience and the kind of social isolation, blended learning being difficult with connectivity being an issue. So that's where that came from.
Thank you. That's helpful. And just my final question: you're recommending, it's still on the theme of what we can do for young people in recovery, and recommending investment in skills development and education. And again, I just wondered if you could give examples, if you've got particular things in mind that you could expand on.
I wasn't part of that discussion. I don't know if any of my other colleagues were and would like to jump in, but I wasn't part of that, so I wouldn't like to just, yes.
Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
I just, if you do hear me, I do want to mention that we had a very interesting speaker, headmaster from a rural school in Aberdeenshire. And the thing he stressed was not so much the educational aspect of schools in rural areas, but the importance for the children to come together, and the sense of isolation, particularly in rural areas. And so the school has 2 roles, the educational one, but also the aspect of socializing for young people as well. And maybe this isn't directly related to your question, but the speaker from, in fact, it was Orkney, the young person, Miss Gray, and what she said was interesting, was that in Orkney, the students can normally rely upon getting a summer job in hospitality. That just hasn't happened this year. So for young people who are reliant on these part-time jobs, that really will impact on them financially, and perhaps impact on their health and well-being as well, and their ability to socialise. Thank you.
Thanks, Roland. That was a very, very helpful point. Thanks, convener.
Thanks, Beatrice. Our next questions come from Willie Coffey. Willie.
Thanks very much, Donald, and again, thanks to the panel for all the work that you've done. It really helps us greatly to think about how we try to manage this problem going ahead. Earlier on, somebody mentioned self-isolation, sick pay, and I'm sure, like other members of the Parliament, we've had lots of constituents coming forward to us saying that they are still ill with COVID many months after having picked it up, but are finding that they're having to go back to work. Did you get a wee chance to chat about that wider issue and whether that was a fair thing to ask people to do? I mean, I know teachers, for example, that are still feeling the effects of this, and other people that feel compelled to go back to work. So was there any thinking around that kind of issue and whether we should be asking the governments to set up or think about some other type of sick pay arrangement for COVID sufferers who are suffering this long term? And anybody that has any thoughts on that, it would be very welcome. Thank you.
I don't think we had discussions about long COVID in particular, but we did talk about self-isolation and how people shouldn't be sort of punished for that. People who have to self-isolate are not necessarily sick, and they can't always handle their mortgage and their other payments on this kind of statutory sick pay. So I think it's really difficult if you've got someone who is off for a long period of time. But we didn't really stray into long COVID, as far as I know, in the group that I was part of.
Who was it that mentioned a moment ago that was it their son or their nephew he'd lost quite a lot of pay because he had to self-isolate?
Alan.
One of them. Is it Alan? Aye.
Alan.
Alan, could you just tell us a wee bit more about that and type of stuff? Because that will be quite common, that I'm sure, right across Scotland. Could you just tell us a wee bit more about what happened?
My son, my son
Right.
is generally takes home, like I say, £600 a week. He contracted COVID and he was told he had to self-isolate, and that his pay, he'd have to go on statutory sick pay and possibly claim this £500 allowance, which is available to everybody. Since then, other colleagues that he's worked with have also gone off with COVID, and luckily his employer has decided to give them 80% of the wages onto furlough, but not every employer can actually afford to do that. So I think the grant scheme, or the IBA scheme, where you should get a proportion of your wages, I think that's what we actually discussed at the meeting.
Right. So do you think that's an area that the two governments, if they can, could do a little bit more to assist people?
I think so. I know with my own son, who actually rang me up, and he was saying he can't afford to stay off. So they actually tell his boss whether he's got COVID or shall he stay off. And if he was thinking the same, and his two colleagues in work was thinking the same, that's going to increase the spread. So people aren't going to self-isolate if they can't afford to feed themselves, or they can't afford to pay bills, pay the mortgage, etc. I think there's a big fear for him. Luckily, I said, there are parents like myself who said, right, don't worry about it, we'll help you out. But should we be doing that? It should be a government task to actually support self-isolators.
And I guess we're probably not collecting that information either nationally to gauge the extent of it. It's probably much wider than we think.
One of the things that he did say, and I thought was quite strange, is that if I go to work, who will know? If I don't mention it, who's going to police it and need to work? So he's thinking that, so many others are thinking it as well.
Okay. Right. Thanks very much for that, Alan. Thank you, everybody, and back to you, convener.
That's okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Willie. Could I turn next to Maurice Corrie, please?
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the work you've done on your panel with this this whole report, which, I must say, is most interesting. Can I turn to Joe first about communications throughout the pandemic? Obviously, this has been very important, and you make a comment in the conclusions in the report that the Scottish Government should explain their strategies and evidence and informs their decision making. Now you go on to say letting the scientists take the centre stage. Did you determine that this was a priority in your group?
I think we did. I think we felt that the daily briefings are an excellent kind of communication tool, but they're very short term. So every day it's the daily numbers, it's the kind of daily difficult and bad news. What we felt people were lacking as this goes on is a kind of end point in mind and an understanding of where we're all heading to together. So I think the daily briefings are great, but they don't give anyone a kind of overarching sense of what this is all for. And I said earlier, I feel like the strategy has probably evolved from Protect the NHS, where we were last March. And I think now that the government has sort of evolved its strategy, this is my perception, but I feel like the government strategy has evolved to more of a saving lives as an essential rather than just as a way to protect the NHS. And that hasn't really been communicated as the new plan. So I think we're missing the big picture and we're always focused on the short. Are today's numbers higher than yesterday's? And that's what becomes the media narrative. So I think we need some sort of big engaging piece that we can all hang on to, and that will help us get through these final months of what is hopefully the final lockdown.
And did you see how that was going to be done? Did you come up with any sort of ideas on that? That might be dealt with?
I think we talked about, I think the government has done a great job, and every piece of evidence that they have is always referred to that it's now on the website. And so all that information is available, but it sort of relies on people being engaged enough to go to the website and dig it out and keep on top of these things. I think some of the panel members felt that having some scientists take some of the briefings in order to answer some of the more probing questions around the data would be something that would be really reassuring for people.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jo, for that. Can I now turn to Roland? Roland, in the report, it talks about very much the mental health and social care aspects in the conclusions. And on balance, what was your group's priority, mental health or social care? And it's a hard question, and you may say the two go together, but can you sort of maybe drill down on that as to what you felt was the stronger of the two, the more important of the two?
That's a really difficult question. I think the fact that the Scottish Government have progressed our report on social care, that allowed us maybe focus more on the mental health issue, that we realised that something was actually being done about social care. But we were concerned that staff in social care were maybe being sidelined in respect compared to the frontline workers in the NHS. But it's been quite evident that the situation in nursing home and care for the elderly, that this is a really important aspect. But we were also aware of the issues concerning mental health as well, and perhaps the importance of exercise and the careful reopening of gyms and swimming pools to assist people to remain fit, because that impacts on people's mental as well. But we were also aware that this would have to be done very carefully, because this would involve people more travelling, and that in itself could increase risks as well.
And so what you're saying there, Roland, in fact, is that probably social care is more fixable, quicker.
Possibly, yes. That there's already work being done in that. Mental health is quite challenging. It's underfunded. It's being addressed by a great number of charities. It's possible for people to fall through the net. So that is an issue that has really only started, or has yet to start to be addressed.
Roland, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, convener. That's all my questions.
Thank you. Before I turn to Annabel Ewing, I think Chris Watkins wanted to come back in on that. Chris.
Yeah, I'd actually put my hand up originally in respect of the question about letting the scientists take centre stage. And just to add to what Joe said, I think we spent one day listening to lots of different, mostly scientific speakers, and we found it so enlightening and so helpful. And I think that's where some of us were coming from. Gosh, the public should be hearing these people speaking, because it really helped us. And could I also add, in terms of what was just being said about social care, we didn't really come up with what was the most important. But one thing I'd like to ask was, with now know there's been this review of adult social care, we haven't heard much about that on the news. And I think it would be interesting for people to hear what is happening about that. What are the recommendations? How's that being taken forward? I think that's really important for the public to hear, that the government is responding to the public's concern about social care.
Thank you for that, Chris. Just to let you know, there was in fact a debate in the Scottish Parliament on the report on Tuesday this week. But I think that's a very, very fair point, and I'm sure it will, going forward this year, it will continue to play quite an important role in political discourse, as it were.
But I think the public should hear it. We're not hearing what that is happening, because everybody's concerned about social care, and we need to hear it.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear, and we'll take that point onwards.
Thank you.
Could I turn to Annabel Ewing, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, colleagues, and good morning to our representatives of the Citizens Panel. And I too would wish to thank you all very much indeed for the time that you have made available to this project. And it's really heartening to hear that you have found it to be a useful, productive and enjoyable process, and you're all very, very welcome to the committee this morning. I appreciate time is pressing, so I'll just ask two questions, if I may, picking up on issues in your very interesting report. The first, I was struck by the comment, and I'm not sure to whom I should direct this question, but it was a comment about the need to be aware of and follow, where appropriate, international best practice. And it just struck me that actually over the last days, it's as if we're living in some little bubble somewhere, because I don't recall hearing very much about what other countries are doing, what stage they're at, except with a few exceptions where there's been a very minor outbreak in countries where they really have very, very low transmission or none. So I just wonder, in terms of ensuring that we all can be informed by international best practice, obviously there'll be a role for government, but do you think the broadcast and print media have a role in this regard? And I don't know if maybe this is a question perhaps for Joe.
Yes. So the discussion we had was around, I think it came from a discussion of how we quickly learn the lessons, quickly implement them. And we know that we're not in a position of exclusion strategy because we're too late, which is why we settled on elimination. We're not in a position to close borders before cases get in. That was a year ago. That's too late. But we felt there were elements that we could kind of piece together. So there's countries which have had more effective test and trace systems, countries which have been able to close their borders, even though they've obviously have community transmission. They're in control of their borders in a way which we're not entirely. So they've been able to close their borders to stop mutation leading to vaccine escape. So there were elements that we felt that we would like just to know more about, so that we could piece them together into something a little bit stronger. I think it would be wonderful if the media covered things like that. I think that sometimes the daily briefing format feeds into the media doing a different kind of narrative, one that is probably more narrow and focused, like you say, and as if we exist just by ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I do recall actually a time not so long ago when we did hear, what was the situation in France, or, what was happening in Germany, or because it is interesting. And as people, are rightly thinking, oh, I would love a summer holiday somewhere in the sun, but, it's not looking that likely at the moment. Equally, the other part of that equation is, well, what's it like in the other country concerned? And we're not seeming to get that bit of information. But the other area I wanted to ask about, and I suspect this might be Roland, again, picking up on a point in the report, and that was the recognition that social distancing and face coverings are probably here for some time to come, and notwithstanding the, I would say, successful rollout thus far of the vaccination, there's more work to be done there, and we wait to see the impact of vaccination on transmissibility and a whole host of other things. So I think the point was being made that messaging would be very important here, so that people didn't have false expectation that the minute you're vaccinated, even with the second dose, that's it, everything is fine, we all go back to where we were. Roland, you're smiling.
Yeah, there's probably two aspects to that question. One, we were all very concerned about the people that do have to go to work, and comment was made by one panel member that he was very concerned because the train that he has to take is often overcrowded. People don't bother wearing the masks, and there was a whole discussion about how this should be enforced, mask wearing and social distancing, and we were aware that, as you say, this will have to continue, and that's maybe related to another topic that we haven't really touched on, was the way the press have reported on things, raising people's expectations, certainly among the panel, maybe because we've been briefed by so many scientists, that there was certainly an understanding on our part that this is going to take some time before people can return to normal. And be it going on holiday this summer, another aviation expert that we heard from, who I thought would be really supportive of the airline industry, was really very critical of the way that they're continuing to sell holidays, getting people to purchase tickets and then telling them, well, actually, you can't travel. But so this I don't know if this quite answers your question, but the panel, I think, are at the end of the day are much more cautious than maybe politicians there, and we hopefully represent the wider public, that we're probably more cautious than the press would lead one to believe. So those were interesting discussions that we had.
Thank you for that, Roland. I tend to agree that, in my experience, people are very realistic about this. They're very realistic. They don't want, overblown information. They want the facts, to the extent that we can come up with facts. They don't want a lot of hyperbole, and they will then make their own judgments in their own lives.
There's another aspect to learning from other nations, not just the positive aspect, but one of the speakers mentioned that one African country, there had been 25 vaccinations, and this was really brought home to us that there can't be nation nationalism. This is something that has to be rolled out worldwide, and we won't be safe until the rest of the world is vaccinated. And maybe that's something, again, that the press haven't really focused clearly on, but it was something that very much was brought home to us.
Absolutely, Roland, I entirely agree. The committee, I absolutely agree, Roland. The committee has actually focused on that issue quite a bit, and I know my colleague John Mason, who I think is coming next, has been one who's raised that issue absolutely continuously, because you're absolutely right. We live as a world, and if we don't vaccinate as a world, then we don't come out of this, really. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you, convener.
I think, before I turn to John Mason, for the final set of questions. I think Neil wants to come back in here. Neil, would you like to comment?
Yeah, it was just to reiterate what Roland had said at the last minute there. I mean, this is not a nationalist strategy. It should be a global strategy. I think it was Jason Leach that told us we're not safe until everybody is safe. We'll have to look at this as a global incident and take it from there. That's all I have to say, really.
Thanks, Neil. Could I finally turn to John Mason for his questions?
Thanks very much, Convener, and appreciate the fact we've touched on the international aspect already, which is good. Another aspect of this which I'm interested in is taxation, and I think this may be under Chris's section. I was very interested that the panel had looked at taxation, and I just wondered, again, if you could expand a little on what the thinking was. I mean, do you think the public are willing to pay a bit more tax in order to, boost the NHS or help the economic recovery, that kind of thing?
Whilst we did touch on this, it didn't become a really in-depth discussion that really took us to any great conclusions beyond the statement we have there. The one thing I remember, the group I was in did talk about was the need to look at corporation tax, which had been cut earlier, a number of years ago, and that we do need to look at the whole tax structure, if you like. That was touched upon, but we didn't really come up with anything particularly specific about what the public will be willing to accept. Perhaps this would be, perhaps so. I could come in with one point that we did discuss, although we couldn't actually come to a definite conclusion, was on the idea of universal basic income. And we heard a little bit about that. And some members of the panel felt perhaps it was time to become radical and do something totally different that would really shake up. And that does relate to taxes. Other people felt we didn't know enough and understand enough about it to make any kind of recommendation, but would be interested to hear more. And we did hear that the government had been discussing this and doing some pilot projects. And our only perhaps strong comment that came out about that was there's no point doing universal basic income if you only focus it on unemployed people, because then we just view it as a different kind of benefit again. It needs to be universal. But that was something we would love to have heard more about, as opposed to just looking at taxes on their own.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point, Chris. And I think I can assure you that there is, both at the Scottish and UK level, people are looking at universal basic income. I think there are some quite practical difficulties, but other people will look at that. Did Joe want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to just expand a little bit on what Chris had said. So the conversation that we had about tax, which I remember, was that we initially had it in the report as to look at what taxes could be raised to help pay for the cost of what the economy has suffered, but we changed it because actually we thought the kind of broader and longer term goal should be a fairer and more equitable Scotland. So that's why we've worded it the way we have. It's not about raising taxes, it's about looking at the changes we can make to the tax system overall so that the wealthier are paying more.
Okay, thanks. And a related point, just my final point really, which maybe Neil, I'm not sure. We talked a little about having a ready-made plan and being better prepared for future pandemics. Was cost was considered as part of that? Because, for example, if we had a huge supply of masks sitting in a warehouse, there would be a cost to that.
Yeah, we didn't really discuss the costings of it, but we did realise what we had seen was from the Cygnus report that was in 2016. We had basically been put in the drawer, which was why we were so slow to react to the pandemic when it first started, with the no PPE, no teams, no special teams. Whereas this Stiglitz report had said this is what we need to be done, but nothing had been done. So what we came to the conclusion is we've learned all these lessons already. We know what we've done wrong, and we know what we've done wrong now. We can put all that together. Somebody could put all that together and have a plan ready for the next one, because we all know there is going to be a next one. That was made clear to us by the scientists, that the pandemics are going to be, I think the estimation was 1 every 100 years. But now we've had one. We had the beginnings of one in the SARS in 2001, and we've had the Ebola. We've had a few various other things, and then we've now got this, which is virtually turned into a pandemic. We do need. We discussed it. We discovered that we do need a plan almost immediately after this. We've sorted this one out to go ahead with the next one that's coming. And what costs, we don't know what's going to cost, but surely, as we discussed, the cost will be against the cost of the lives that was lost during the slow response, because we didn't have a plan, or the plan that we did have wasn't implemented.
Did you think, I mean, I don't know if you discussed this, but do you think the public would be happy, say, we just took a slice of money off the NHS and put it into planning for the next pandemic?
Oh, that's a difficult one. The NHS is always the golden goose. But what I think, what we discussed is the public. If you inform the public what the money is going to be doing, especially during this pandemic, where everybody's found there's 114,000 deaths or more now, especially if you can inform the public where you're taking the money, why you're taking the money, and then show them progress towards that plan. So whenever the next pandemic hits, you've got a mitigation process in place. I think the public would go with you for that.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
We're pretty short on time. I see Chris wants to come in quickly, and then I was going to ask if any of the citizens panel wants to ask any questions of us as a committee. I don't want to pressurize people, but we do have to move on relatively quickly. So Chris, and then anyone else with a question, please come in using the chat bar on the side.
I guess I'm coming in on that last point, and I think a lot of it wasn't, I don't think you can say we're going to take the money from the NHS. It's much, much broader than that. It covers all sectors of society, economy, and so on. You can't just say it's NHS. But I think the important thing is to have an emergency preparedness plan. So there's a plan that if something happens, this is what we do, and it's immediately ready to start going into action. So we don't have to have weeks of discussion and delays. That was it, really.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris. Any questions for the committee from any of our citizens panel? Either wave or put an R in the chat box. Neil.
Yeah, I was going to ask the committee, have you got any sort of strategy to sort of inform or help the media inform us better?
That's a very good question. In terms of the committee's role, I mean, we can, influencing the media directly is quite difficult for the committee. But what we will do is use your report to inform our work. Clearly, with the election coming in May, the sort of lifespan of the committee will draw to a close at the end of March. But what we do is compile a legacy report, which will certainly involve this process, and in it we will make reference to the recommendations that you've made. We've also got further evidence sessions between now and then to address issues like the strategy to come out of lockdown. We hope to have an evidence session with the First Minister as well. So there are a number of opportunities for the committee to reiterate points that you've made. I see. everyone, I think, wants to come in. So if we could be quick, can I have, please, Roland, followed by Alan, followed by Chris?
Convener, this is more a comment than a question, but following on from the discussion about, it was interesting what Professor Eleanor Riley, immunologist, mentioned, that David Cameron set up a standing committee on vaccination in 2011, and that continued, and that really, she felt, was extremely helpful in being able to roll out the vaccination program so quickly here compared to other countries. So that probably wouldn't have cost very much, but has obviously had a great impact. So maybe other aspects of a pandemic with standing committees might be a useful thing to roll out. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan, and then I'm going to turn to Chris and then bring in a few of my colleagues.
Yeah, the vaccine rollout has been taken part in my area, and it's been mentioned that a lot of over 70s haven't actually taken up the offer of the vaccine for fear of false information or whatever. So what can be done to encourage people to actually take the vaccine? You think slogans like, say, having the vaccine won't kill you, not having it might, you know, to put these ideas into their heads, if you know what I mean.
It's a very live issue, and it's actually one that the committee addressed last week in terms of the witnesses we had about vaccine hesitancy, as it's described. So it's a very live issue, and it's one that we are contemplating and discussing as a committee. Could I come to Chris, and then I think Annabelle and Stuart, who may have points to make or want to answer the questions that have been posed, and then I think we must draw to a close. Chris.
Yeah, my question was around we've been, since we've finished our panel, and in the last days, we've heard that the Scottish Government are announcing their new or the developed strategy next Tuesday, and I would like to ask if our report or what we're discussing today will be fed into that, or is it now too late for all this to be fed into what's happening with the strategy next Tuesday?
I think the report's been published today, and I'm sure the government will take cognizance of it in terms of moving forward. And we will not today, because we're not going to ask the government about your report today because it's just been published, and the government need time to digest it. But in future evidence sessions, we will certainly be discussing your report with them and the recommendations that you make as we scrutinise them on the new strategy. Annabelle and then Stuart, please.
I just briefly wanted to say that the report being published today will be looked at very carefully by the Scottish Government, and absolutely the plans, I suspect, for the announcement next Tuesday are still being discussed, because obviously the data changes every day. So absolutely, this will be an important contribution. And a number of points will relate to longer term issues, of course, and those will be considered. In terms of the issue about the press, and of course that was an issue I raised in my questioning, in terms of one issue, which is international comparisons and best practice. The press listen to this committee's deliberations, I believe, every Thursday. So they're listening at the moment, and it's a very good point that has been raised about the need for more information, more scientific information in mainstream media. So I hope that they are listening and take this on, and maybe we'll see at the next briefing today, maybe we'll see some other questions being asked. Who knows? Thank you.
And lastly, Stuart, please.
Thank you. Actually, Annabelle just stole my thunder on one of the points. But the second point, I did put something in the chat bar earlier on. I took part in a panel with the Citizens' Assembly on Monday, and there's a debate in the Chamber this afternoon from the Citizens' Assembly about that. And I think certainly some of the recommendations today and some of the dialogue today actually does touch upon some of the work from the Citizens' Assembly. I think that it would be very useful to actually put both in touch with each other to have some further dialogue. So I generally think that would be beneficial for both sides.
Thank you, Stuart, for that point, and I noticed it in the chat bar. At this point, can I conclude our consideration of this agenda item, and can I thank all of the participants for their time and their evidence this morning. I mean, we've acknowledged our gratitude about the report, but I think it's been critical in bringing that report to life in a way to have you here this morning discussing it with us, discussing your views, and representing what you felt and your experience of it. And I'd just like to say, it's been a hugely beneficial experience for me personally, and I think I speak for all of us on the committee to have this the citizens panel and have you here this morning. So thank you very much. I'm now going to suspend the meeting to allow a changeover of witnesses, and there is time for a short break, and we will aim to reconvene the meeting at 11 a.m. precisely. Thank you. Thank you. We now move on to agenda item 2. Under this agenda item, the committee will be taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Michael Russell, MSP, Professor Jason Leach, National Clinical Director for the Scottish Government, and Sam Anson, Deputy Director, Improvement, Attainment and Wellbeing. Could I start by apologising for the fact we're running late? We had a delay due to technical reasons at the start of our evidence session on the Citizens Panel. And also, given the importance of the Citizens Panel to the committee's work, I was keen to allow it to run for as long as possible. Our current session gives members the opportunity to take evidence on this week's ministerial statement, first ministerial statement on COVID-19. The committee will also consider the following regulations: the Personal Protective Equipment Temporary Arrangements Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2021, SSI 2021/50. The Scottish Government has also provided a set of draft regulations for this meeting. They are the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 16 Regulations 2021. Cabinet Secretary, can I welcome you to the meeting and can I invite you to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener. And at the outset, I know members of the Citizens Panel are still on the call. Can I just say, having watched the last part of it, that I can confirm that, of course, we would take very seriously and do take seriously as a government the views of the Citizens Panel, as we take seriously the views of the Citizens Assembly, which we'll be debating this afternoon in the Scottish Parliament. And as the Minister responsible for the Citizens Assembly and its establishment, but then I'm very pleased that that type of deliberative democracy is becoming so important to us all. So I hope the Citizens Panel are reassured by that and the fact that their views and their conclusions are of great importance. Convener, the regulations in front of you today implement temporary arrangements to facilitate the production and supply of PPE in Scotland during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. They will bring Scotland into regulatory alignment with England and Wales as part of the Four Nations approach. This is a technical regulation. It's required to undergo a conformity assessment procedure in order to receive a CE mark, that is PPE, before being sold. In March 2020, a European Commission recommendation allowed the EU nations to suspend this requirement in order to facilitate the swift supply of PPE. PPE sold under these arrangements is termed EASE PPE. However, following the end of the transition period, this recommendation no longer applies to England, Scotland and Wales. So domestic regulatory arrangements are required in order to continue that easement. And these regulations allow PPE which has not received a CE mark, but which has been assessed and approved for use by the Health and Safety Executive, to be sold on the open market in Scotland until the 31st of March and to be purchased for the use of the NHS Scotland until the 31st of June. These regulations are only applicable to PPE, which is necessary for protection against COVID-19. If I can turn to the wider question of the review of the strategic framework, we have made substantial progress over the last few weeks in bringing down case numbers, and great credit is due to everyone involved. Hospital and ICU admissions are finally beginning to turn a corner as we see the impact of the stay-at-home rules. But the health service does remain under severe pressure. We're only just back to the overall position we faced in late 2020. We're conducting a fresh review of the approach set out in the strategic framework. The overall aim is to reframe the strategy for the period ahead until the vaccines have successfully been deployed throughout Scotland. The strategic intent continues to be to suppress the virus to the lowest possible level and keep it there, while we strive to return to a more normal way of life for as many people as possible, which we all want. The strategic framework refresh will affirm that approach and the principles we set out in the framework for decision making, including consideration of the 4 harms caused by the virus. It's looking at the experience and effects of the levels approach so far against the backdrop of the evolving science and the experiences we've all had. Now, the refresh won't provide dates for the relaxation of measures. That depends on the course of the pandemic, but it will signal the early priorities in the event the conditions allow for restrictions to be lifted. And our priority rests with a cautious and phased reopening of learning first of all. On Tuesday, the First Minister announced that the first phase of the return to in-person learning will proceed as planned from the 22nd of February, that is from Monday. The way the virus works, we know we need to wait roughly 3 weeks before expecting to see any impact on case numbers of the restart. For that reason, any further return of students will not happen before the 15th of March at the very earliest. And decisions on other changes to the current lockdown will be considered in due course in the context of the refreshed strategic framework. Decisions will be contingent on the epidemiological data and the wider evidence about the rollout and success of the vaccination programme. We should celebrate the success of the vaccination programme, but it doesn't change the approach at this stage. We want any reopening to be sustainable, and that means that we cannot risk our health services. We recognise, of course, that uncertainty is challenging. We're doing all we can to communicate our approach to managing that uncertainty, so it's clear for business and indeed for every citizen the conditions under which decisions are taken. The strategic framework refresh will be informed before publication by discussions with other parties in this Parliament, by the views of business organisations, trade unions, third sector bodies, and of course the panel we've just heard from. The review is being conducted and will report to the Parliament on the outcome. And I hope that places in context some of the discussions that we will have today. And I am joined by Jason Leach, of course, and today by Sam Anson from the Education Directorate, because there may be questions about education, particularly the issuing of the Education Continuity Directive, which is the document required for the next stage.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And can I now turn to questions? And I would remind members that we have approximately 8 minutes each for questions. So please, as ever, can questions and answers be concise? And if there's time for supplementaries, I will indicate that once all members have had a chance to ask. If I could begin by asking the first set of questions. I appreciate there is a limit to what can be said at this point in time in terms of the refresh of the framework. But are you able to say whether it is likely that we will return to a levels framework on a localised level?
Well, I think I indicated, Convener, that would be part of the discussion, but I don't think that discussion is at the stage where we would say that is what will happen. The local authority levels were important, but there are questions such as the size of each unit that need to be looked at again, and things like travel to work areas. In some areas, and you and I know the Highlands particularly well, in some areas local authorities covered an enormous part of the country with very, very different conditions. And we're familiar, for example, with the issue of the Argyll Islands, which is very different from Helensburgh, which is but they're both part of Argyll and Bute. So I think it is fair to say that is an issue that needs and is being considered in it, and the views of the committee and everybody else need to be taken into account while we discuss that.
I don't know if Jason Leach wants to come in here, but linked to that, I had a question on the metrics or the indicators that are used to determine restrictions going forward. Do you foresee a change to the current indicators that are used in light of the new variants, in light of the vaccine, etc.?
I think that is an issue, undoubtedly an issue for Jason, but it is, I can confirm, also one of the issues which is being discussed. Do we have all you never have all the right data, at the right time, but are there other issues that we need to consider? And of course, the 4 harms have to be a key part of this, but I'm sure Jason will want to answer it.
Hi, everybody, and good morning, Convener. Thank you for having me back. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So, in answer to your first question about geography, yes, the advice will have to contain some implications for the geography of Scotland. Just to illustrate that point, yesterday, the 7-day average for Scotland per 100,000 was 102. Which is very good progress, slow but sustained progress, and takes us back to what Mr Russell just said around the numbers we had around the beginning of December. But that massive regional variation. East Ayrshire is over 300. And I looked up somebody else. Clackmannanshire is 241. West Dunbartonshire is 224. 13 local authorities are above 100. Now, the 100 is the average, so of course there are going to be some above 100. But we have to be cautious about what that geographical unit is, whether that should be local authorities, collections of local authorities, whether it should be health boards, and that is all being discussed in the weeks that we've had and in this week leading up to the Cabinet deciding on the final version of that strategic framework. To your second point about data, I think we've learned a great deal about what we did with the first version of levels, and they will be better this time because we learn more. The WHO have published a relatively new document, end of November, and they're going to update it all the time. And by definition, it's a compromise. It's 194 countries. It's advice for the world, so we have to adapt it to make it Scottish. But they have created their own levels. Now, confusingly, they've also given them the same numbers as we have, so we need to be careful that they don't relate directly to our levels. That, I imagine, is going to become a problem in communication in the next little while. But they talk about 4 principal data points, and you won't be surprised to know it's test positivity, incidence, hospitalisation and mortality. And it gives ranges over a 2-week period, actually, interestingly, because they know it takes a long time, over a 2-week period for each of those. So just to illustrate it, to get to level 2 in the WHO levels, not our levels, you have to have a test positivity below 5 and an incidence below 50. To get to level 1, you have to have an incidence below 20 and a test positivity below 2. So we will use that WHO framework to inform our advice that will go to ministers.
Thank you very much for that. Can I move on to my next question, which is about the change in shielding policy south of the border, which you'll be aware of, which I think expanded on the basis of a new model, expanded the criteria for the shielding list with I think an increase of 1.7 million people to come within the shielding description. Could I just ask, is the Scottish Government going to do anything similar in Scotland in terms of the shielding list?
That is for Jason, I think.
So we keep that shielding list under constant review. Let's remember what shielding is. It's pretty horrible. It's not something we want people to have to do, but it's for protection. The present set of shielding advice stays in place for this level of the virus, and we want to remove that just as soon as we get that prevalence down. This is based on a model called Q-COVID, and it includes about 50 variables for individuals based on ethnicity, age, weight, disease, demography, a host of other things. It's validated on English data only, and therefore we've chosen not to use it directly. However, we already have quite a lot of those variables included in our shielding list. All the 4 countries have a slightly different version of shielding. The basis is the same, but we have a variation in there. So, for example, and forgive the bluntness of choosing one condition, we already shield those with Down syndrome. In England, they will now be included in the new 1.7 million that they're adding. So we're confident that our variables are the right variables for Scotland, and GPs and clinical teams, secondary care, hospital clinical teams, have always had the ability to add people to that shielding list if they think they need 2 things. 1, protection, and 2, support. And it's the support element for supermarket delivery slots, for other elements of that support that might become useful. So the short answer, Convener, is not directly using the Q-COVID model. We don't think it applies to our version of shielding, but a lot of what is included definitely does.
That's really helpful. I've got one final quick question. It's really an observation. It's about the vaccination of unpaid carers, especially family carers. And just to keep that on your radar, I've had some communication about that. Jason, I don't know if you want to quickly come back on that.
Only that they'll be in Group 6, that really, really difficult and large group. It's the most complex group so far. It includes them, it includes the clinically vulnerable. So lots of versions of how to do that. And one of the things which the First Minister has said, there'll be a way of finding those people. And we'll need a variety of ways of finding them. And one of them, I imagine, whether you like it or not, will be via MSPs. And there will be a mechanism by which, like we've tried to help you all the way along, there'll be a mechanism by which you can help us with that.
Thank you. I now turn to Alec Rowley for his questions. Alec.
Cabinet Secretary, you said that in terms of the regulations, it's pretty technical regulation in terms of PPE, but can I focus my first question on that? Firstly, in terms of the supplies of PPE, are we satisfied that there is plenty of supply of PPE? And secondly, in terms of the use of PPE in medical establishments, there has been some questions raised about the effectiveness of what we are using around particularly face masks. And thirdly, in that area again, PPE, are we satisfied? I mean, the take-up of people wearing face coverings, the compliance with it, I think, is pretty good. But there are some countries where they are not simply using like these types of face coverings, but they are venturing into more protective face coverings for the general public as well. I think Germany is one country where I've seen that happening. Is that something that would help the ongoing fight to suppress the virus, or are we simply not at that stage?
Let me deal with the first part, and then I'll ask Jason to deal with the other two parts, Mr. Rowley. On the first part, the National Services Scotland, the NHS supply body, holds a 4-month stockpile of CE marked PPE. That is what we're dealing with in the regulations. So we're confident that that is sufficient. The reason for this regulation is a lacunae between one set of European regulations that allowed the CE mark not to take place, and another set of European regulations which is continuing, which says that they are required. Now, this is one of these, to be honest, and I hate to mention it in this context, one of these Brexit messes, and we don't want to get into that. And that's why this is necessary, and that's why it's necessary to ensure there is a continuity. So that is why it is technical. On the wider issue of usage, of type of masks, of usage, I think Jason really needs to answer that.
Mr. Rowley, it's a good question, and from the very beginning of this pandemic, there have been calls for whatever layer people get asked to wear, according to the evidence. There's been some within that group who want the layer above. It's been consistent from the public through the health service, the social care service, through to intensive care. So the way we've resolved that, and it's the way every country resolves it, is we've put a group of experts together to answer that question on our behalf. That's our nosocomial reference group. And that's because they look particularly at in-hospital and in-care home transmission. It's chaired by Professor Jackie Riley, Scotland's foremost expert in infection and prevention control. And they look constantly at the evidence from around the world, the evidence from Scotland, and they give us the best advice they can about what we should all be using in terms of PPE. From intensive care doctors and nurses dealing with COVID, down to people at the front line in EDs, in ambulances, etc. And their advice is the present level of protection is the right level of protection for what we're doing. That doesn't mean that that won't change, but for now, in the middle of February, that's the advice. We also have another group of experts who do infection and prevention control for the public, and that's about our face coverings, about our hand washing, about all the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And again, they keep that under constant review. You're right. Some countries have moved to a slightly higher level. It's not the whole of Germany, it's bits of Germany, so it's not quite as straightforward as sometimes it seems in the media, and it's particularly where you can't keep 2 meters apart. So it's in particular parts of their society, it's not universal. And again, that expert group looks at that evidence all the time and has decided and given us advice that the present level of protection is the right level of protection.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's helpful, and perhaps that's an area that needs to be explored further in terms of workplaces where it's more and more difficult to social distance. But it brings me on to my next question, and the briefing for SPICE shows that, well, Mr. Russell said that we needed to suppress the virus and keep it there, and that's the way forward, and I understand that, but I equally understand the threat of that not happening as we try and open up again. The briefing that we've had today for SPICE shows that there is a sort of uptake and outbreak in East Ayrshire. I understand it's linked perhaps to Kilmarnock Prison, West Lothian. Yesterday it was announced in Fife, the Letham ward within Cameron Hospital. There was a cluster, 21 staff and patients all tested positive. So my question is, how are we learning from those outbreaks? Are we learning anything from those outbreaks that is going to be useful moving forward in terms of keeping, as Mr. Russell said, the virus suppressed? Yeah, so that would be the main question. What are we learning from it? Is there anything we're learning from it? And is that feeding into the strategy for opening up again?
I think Jason has to answer this, but I would make the point that you're making a really, really good point about digging into the data. And it relates almost directly back to the first point that the convener raised, which is, and I've got the SPICE chart in front of me, and Jason has quoted other figures. You have to understand that this is data organized by geography, and therefore it isn't therefore data organized in another way that, for example, as you've said with Kilmarnock Prison, you could organize it by those areas that have prisons, and then you get another reading about what's taking place. So I think it's really important that we understand that no presentation of data is perfect. All presentation of data actually has, at the moment you present it, a bias in it, because it's to do with the way in which it's organized. But Jason will want to address in more detail, I'm quite sure, the question of what we learn from that data.
I think there's two things, Mr. Rowley. You make an excellent point that we have to learn all the time. The fundamentals of this virus stay the same, and they are the same since last March. If you bring humans into contact, you risk spread, particularly when you've got 1,000 cases a day like we had yesterday, and you've got a prevalence of 100 per 100,000. So if you bring people into contact in a workplace, in a prison, in a pub, in a school, there is a risk that transmission will happen. And therefore, reducing transmission requires less human interaction. I'm sorry to be so blunt. So at some level, that's what we see in the outbreaks. When you examine the outbreaks, it's because somebody with the virus, inadvertently usually, because it comes as a great surprise to everybody when they catch it, they have gone somewhere, touched a surface, been next to somebody, not necessarily doing anything outside the rules, but somewhere in there, the virus has just managed to find a way to get from person to person. The second thing we learn is where there is particular vulnerability. So the easiest example for that is food processing plants. It became apparent in the first half of last year, that food processing was a major risk. And workplaces that did that, because of the cold, the poor ventilation, the closeness of the individuals, they were a risk. First happened in Germany, then happened in Wales, and then happened in Scotland. We have then adapted our guidance and our advice for food processing. Much, much stricter testing, much higher levels of non-pharmaceutical intervention, better distancing, all of that. Prisons takes us down exactly that same path. And the learning in prisons is then shared with all the other prisons. So there's the fundamental learning that we get from every outbreak, and then there's the individual learning from the location that the outbreak happens in. And we saw that in hospitality, in gyms, in schools, and we've tried to learn each of those as the industry learn them as well.
I'll conclude, convener, but the only sort of alternative with that answer is that we have suppressed that as best as we can. We start to open up. Are we on a merry-go-round? Because my specific was really, how do we, for example, if it's using PPE in workplaces where people are closer together, how do we actually stop ourselves just going back and forward and hitting another another phase of the virus and back into lockdown? Because just now lockdown seems the only real tool that is able to suppress the virus.
So three things, I think. Mr. Elliott, that's a long question. It's a long answer to that question, actually, because that's the heart of the global response to the virus. That question is the key question for every country and the WHO. Three things very quickly. Test and protect, finds the outbreaks, deals with the chains of transmission. When the numbers become lower, it becomes almost more important. It's good now, and it will be good then, but it becomes more crucial to stop. Remember the days when we had an outbreak in Gretna? We managed it, it didn't spread. That's the world we're looking to get back to. Number two is vaccination. Vaccination was not here in wave one. Vaccination is now here in the end of wave two. And all of the science suggests it's going to help us get out of it. And it's going to protect particularly those who are vulnerable. And number three, importation of new strains. So we have to stop it coming back. That's what happened in the summer. We brought it back. And we have to stop that happening again. So those three things, there's a host of others. The WHO has 6, in fact, one of which is communicating with the public, which speaks to your earlier point with your panel and the fact we spent some time with them. But the three things I would give in immediate answer to your question are those three.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alec. Our next questions come from Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. And this follows on from earlier questions about geographical areas. This week, the Scottish Government responded to a letter where I and my colleagues, Liam MacArthur and Alistair Carmichael, had asked the Scottish Government to consider testing at island entry points. The response was disappointing because it didn't actually tell us anything about the Government's thinking on that specific issue. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, has the Scottish Government discussed testing before travel to the islands with island health boards, island local authorities and transport providers?
Well, I think I'd want Jason Leach to address that. I mean, I haven't seen this letter. I remember raising this issue at a previous committee meeting. I was unaware that there was a response, but then I wouldn't be. So I think that Jason should address that point. And of course, if you're dissatisfied with the response, then I think we have to look at it again and see what more information we can give or what more consideration we can give. But Jason might want to respond to
it. I don't think I've seen the actual response, Ms. Wishart, but I'm very happy to look at it and get other advice or consider it afresh. Testing in importation is crucial, whether that's the Western Isles, the whole of Scotland, the whole of the UK, or further afield. But it is only one part. It only tells you don't have the virus today. It doesn't tell you about tomorrow or the day after. So we've got to be very careful. So as part of a system, I'm entirely comfortable with testing being part of a system. You can see us doing that in schools as part of a safety system, in care homes as part of a safety system. What we don't want to do is think that testing allows behaviour change. It does not.
Thanks. That's a helpful answer. I mean, I would notice that between the 8th and the 14th of February, 581 tests were taken in Shetland and they only returned one positive result. So it's not unreasonable to think there's a logic to introducing testing ahead of travel to the islands. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would commit to further talks then with island representatives and health boards to see whether testing at entry points could be introduced.
Well, I'm an island representative myself, as you know. So if you would like to, I think you probably got me on a vulnerable spot there. So if you would like to come back to me with the letters, which I have not seen, then I'll do my best to take it up. I can't guarantee an outcome, but I'm not unsympathetic to what you're saying.
Well, I thank you for that. That's helpful. If consideration can be given to the actual issue, that would be appreciated. I shall come back to you. Can I turn to schools? I previously asked the Education Secretary about whether decisions about reopening schools in the islands would be dependent on case rates seen in the Central Belt. So can I ask when the issue was last discussed with island councils and what the Scottish Government's current position is on local versus national decision making in terms of schools reopening? I mean, should islands anticipate some deviation from the national line in the coming weeks, given that we're in level 3 status?
I think that's a really important point. And again, as an island representative, I'm fully familiar with it. I receive communications on this on a regular basis from some of the islands within my own area who are on level 3 and who are arguing for schools to return more quickly. I do know it's been part of the consideration of whether the national rollout can be varied. There are, of course, issues, and I'd want Jason just to comment on this too. There are also issues of being very aware that the issue of school transmission is not just transmission within school, it is a meeting around school, it is the involvement of parents, and we also know, for example, we know from Barra how an island outbreak can be very severe and can move very, very quickly, particularly given the constrained nature of island communities. So it's not just as simple, though I'm saying you're saying it would be, but it's not just as simple as saying because there is an island and because it appears to be more self-contained, we could move in that way. I think there are other considerations to be had. But I'm happy to address the particular point of discussions that are taking place. And if and I'll take away from here trying to give you some more information on that. But equally, Jason might like to say a word or two about why this is a wider issue than just an individual school on an individual island.
Yes, I wonder if Mr. Russell and I have been coming to this committee for too long, because I was going to use exactly the same example to make exactly the same point. I have enormous sympathy for the islands wanting more steps out faster than the rest, faster than the mainland. The counter argument to that is the nature of the island health and social care system and the speed of transmission. So Barra is the obvious example to use there. So Barra had no cases. Schools open, and you're thinking, why don't we open the pubs and the restaurants? Why don't we go back to in-house mixing? Suddenly, you're at 4 cases, 5 cases, 60 cases, and 1/10 of the island is self-isolating. And you have to helicopter people to Stornoway and to the mainland. And it happens in 2 weeks. So we have to be cautious. Well, I think schools, we would much rather, as public health advisors, do schools nationally, if we could. It seems like the right thing to do for the well-being of the children, in a gradual, very careful return for their health and well-being. That doesn't mean that the decision makers or us, if the Western Isles goes virus-free for a sustained period, then we won't be able to do something a little bit different. But I think some things will be national and some things will be more regional.
Thank you. I would just observe, I mean, in referencing the schools, the national return to school, I just reference a call I had with a distressed father earlier this week, very concerned about his child who's in P4 and the distress that they're feeling about not being able to go back to school and not having interaction with their peers. It just rather hit home about the individual impact on young people. But I thank both Professor Leach and the Cabinet Secretary for their answers today. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Beatrice. Our next questions come from John Mason, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. If I could start with the quarantine hotels. There is a certain amount of concern, I think, about the cost of these for people who cannot afford them. British Red Cross have been on about this. I think it's affecting students. And I had constituents myself who have given up, finished their contract in New Zealand, trying to get back, haven't got £2,400 for a couple. Can we say anything about how this is being handled and the fund?
Yes, and I think we should provide MSPs with details of the funding that is available for those who cannot afford this. And I think we should make it clear equally. If people are coming back, from as part of a job, and they're having to do this as part of a job, then clearly one would hope that employers would also be engaged on this. The issue of students is being actively addressed. The numbers are very low. The numbers presently are very low. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they won't increase, and of course we do believe that there should be a further increase in the countries that are covered, and that is a matter of ongoing discussion. But if we don't wish to create hardship, and if people cannot afford it, then clearly there has to be help, and we should be more explicit, I think, with members about what that help is and how it can be accessed. But it is being offered.
That's helpful, great. And yes, if we could get more information, then it helps us help constituents and so on. Thank you.
We'll make a commitment.
Secondly, I attended the cross-party group on Israel this week, and we were learning about the vaccination programme in Israel, which is considerably ahead of the rest of the world, as I understand it. They have faced the situation that as they got to younger people, then there is a certain amount of resistance and reluctance to take up the vaccine. And even I understand there's a centre just sitting in the middle of the city and people can drop in anytime, and still young people are not doing that. So I just wonder what we can learn from that, and if we're anticipating more difficulties with younger people and how we will address that.
I'll ask Jason to respond to that, but I have seen some evidence that there is likely to be a greater, but still small, lack of uptake by younger people. And I think we will all have to learn about how we can overcome that. And as Israel is I think one of the global leaders in vaccination, and I'm sure that they are also considering how they can tackle it, and that we should all be learning from each other. I think the message from elected representatives, and I've said this often at this committee before, has to be absolutely clear. And to be fair, I think it has been, with one possible exception. I think there has to be absolute clarity that this is a very, very good thing, and that people should be getting vaccination whenever it is offered to them. And there are no grounds for believing that this is in any way a detrimental step. Now, some people will simply not believe that, but I hope we can persuade people of it. But Jason may know more than I know, and is likely to know more than I do, about how this has been considered by clinicians.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I've also been in touch with my Israeli counterparts, Mr. Mason. I've got contacts there, and they have done very, very well. They're the only large country ahead of the UK in terms of percentages of the population vaccinated. They've really had an excellent programme. There is global evidence that as you move down through age groups, people are more vaccine hesitant. It's partly vaccine laziness rather than actual intellectual approach to it. So it's about making it easy for people and finding those individuals. I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week, but we've been involved with a thing called the Vaccine Hesitancy Project. And the senior clinicians of the UK had a presentation from the leader of that last Tuesday night. And it's an excellent website as a resource for MSPs and for many others about what makes up that vaccine hesitancy group, because it is not anti-vaccine people. It is people with genuine questions about science and side effects and how they would get it and how it protects them and what it means for the future. And that's exactly the thing we should do. Their fundamental advice is surround every demographic you have with the correct advice. Don't fight the anti-vaccine advice. Just surround every demographic you have with the correct evidence and advice. And we're doing that in young people just as we're doing in older people. We're going to use trusted voices. We will use Young Scot. We'll use all the third sector organisations you would expect. It won't be me on TikTok. It will be people they recognise, etc., etc. The only other thing I would add is the same evidence tells us that we'd be lucky to get to 80% in the over 70s. And we've got to nearly 100% in pretty much every group we've tackled so far. I mean, I would not have believed you that 100% of over 80s would take the vaccine. It's quite remarkable. So if that continues and granny tells daughter and daughter tells granddaughter, I think we can go for big, big numbers in those lower age groups. And I look forward to being part of that solution.
Thanks so much for that. And my third and final point would be concerning treatment of people who are tested positive. Greater Glasgow and Clyde sent us in an appeal, really, asking for volunteers for people who have been tested positive to take part with a drug, which I think is called favipiravir or something like that. Where are we going with that? Is the treatment making progress for people who are tested positive?
I'm not sure that one specifically. I'd have to look into it for you. There are ongoing drug trials in all of our health boards, but principally the big ones, Lothian and Glasgow, but elsewhere. The basic structure for that is the recovery trial. And if you just Google recovery trial, you'll find the UK version of all of these drug trials. It's how we know dexamethasone works and how we know hydrochloroquine doesn't. And any candidate drug any drug that looks good in small trials ends up in the recovery trial, and then we recruit across the whole of the UK in COVID hospitals, COVID wards, and we try each of these drugs with permission from people to be part of that trial. So I don't know that specific one, but if it's a candidate drug that shows promise, it will go in the recovery trial. We'll do a big scale trial, and then we'll use it if we need it.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, John. Our next questions come from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Morning to you both. I wanted to ask a question which I've asked before, which is about the prioritisation for the vaccine of those under 50 who are not clinically vulnerable, teachers, shop workers. However, I suspect you're not going to want to answer that question until you've had the JCVI advice on that. So I wanted to ask you, when do you expect to get that advice? Do you have a date? Do you have a time frame for
that? Jason, I think, would answer that.
So I don't have a date. I know it is soon. They're meeting today, and that will be one of the things on their agenda. So it is imminent. I think I can probably say. It's up to them, of course, when they tell us and when they publish it. They're entirely independent of us. We can ask them questions, and you can be sure that the UK government and the Scottish government have asked that question, and they watch the news like the rest of us. They know it is an active issue, and it will come out. I would just say what I've said previously, Mr. Ruskell, that the vaccine is about risk of disease, risk of serious disease and death. And that gets a little bit more tricky as you get under 50 because the mortality falls dramatically. But we still need to think about risk. We also need to think about how easy it is to do the vaccination programme. Because if we can go fast, that's better. So we need to think about categories in which we can go really quickly. And age helps us to do that, partly. That's why we've been able to go so quickly up to this point, because we know where everybody is and we know what age they are via their GP and health records.
Okay, so imminent could be next week, it could be a couple of weeks' time. I'll read into that, whatever.
Yes, it could be either. It could be either of them.
Okay. Can I ask then about what the process is in Scotland once we've got the JCVI advice? Is it a matter of saying, well, you know, we haven't bucked a JCVI recommendation 30 years, therefore rubber stamp it? Or if there is some discretion within the JCVI advice around prioritising teachers, for example, or maybe some other group, what's then the process for discussion of that, potentially debate within Parliament if there are political choices, and then eventual decision? I mean, I'm assuming that there won't be decisions made on this during the parliamentary recess as we head up to an election, in which case there'll be a vacuum in terms of debate. If it's imminent, perhaps it will be in March, perhaps in the next few weeks. But I'm just trying to unpick what we should expect here. Will it be rubber stamping, or will there be an element where we can consider the broader harms and we can consider the benefits of opening up certain parts of society on the back of the vaccine programme?
I think that Jason would want to answer that, but can I just say that, you know, from a purely process point of view, and I'm not expressing any opinion, from a purely process point of view, I would expect that the advice to the Cabinet would come from the Chief Medical Officer, the Clinical Director, essentially about, you know, what they would recommend we did. Of course, very heavily in our minds would be that we have not departed from such advice, and would, as a matter of course, I think be very reluctant to depart from that advice. But I think the information, having considered what will be, you know, a recommendation based on a great deal of technical information, amongst other things, would the position of the advisor, the people who advise the Cabinet, would be of crucial importance. And one of them is here, so better hear from them rather than me.
I think you've probably summarised it relatively well, Mr. Russell and Mr. Ruskell. I think you probably know the answer. The JCVI advice will come into the senior clinicians of the Scottish Government. We will then give our advice to the First Minister and the Cabinet, and then it will be a matter of judgment for them to decide. My advice, to be clear, my advice will be to follow the advice of the Joint Committee for Vaccination. If the Joint Committee for Vaccinations say, we don't mind what you do under 50, that could be one extreme, then we would give some advice about what we think Scotland should do. If they say, this is absolutely what you should do, you should not depart from this, you should go through the decades in order until you vaccinate everybody, that will be the advice I give the Scottish Government. So it will depend partly on what they say, and it may not be either of those clear binary choices. It might be more nuanced than that, and there will be a judgment to make, and then it will be up to Mr Russell and others how they engage with you and the Parliament about making those choices.
Okay, that's helpful. That brings a little bit more clarity. If we just stay with yourself, Professor Leach, I mean, you said earlier on about the priority needing to be that we stop bringing back viruses and new variants into the country. I wanted to ask you though about the evolution of new variants within the UK, and particularly the E484K mutation of the spike virus, which is appearing, I gather, in a lot of the variants. It's the way that the virus attacks and produces a lot of sensitivity. There's a new framework coming out next week. How exactly are you going to address the evolution of variants? Because the evolution of the variants, because as I understand it, there is a point where there is some risk that we see new variants continue to emerge as transmissibility is still within the population, and the vaccine has yet to kind of suppress that fully. So how do we tackle that? How do we ensure that those new variants are not being created within our islands?
You're absolutely right. The higher the prevalence, the more likely the virus is to mutate, of course, because the more chances it has as it jumps from person to person and mutates. That's what it does. The E48, remember, there are multiple changes in this virus all the time, and there are only some that matter. Most don't matter at all. The virus stays fundamentally the same, no change in distribution, no change in reaction. Every so often, one happens that does something new. One is the one that's causing the increased transmission. That's being consistently seen in the Brazilian, the South African, and the Kent variant. That's a single mutation that causes the virus to be more transmissible. The E484 version is not the standard Kent variant, but is in South Africa and Brazil, and it's harder to find on testing. You need to do genomics. And it appears, it's very early days, it appears that variant may escape the vaccine a little. It's not vaccine yes, no, it's vaccine a little less effective. So we need to watch for it. It doesn't seem to be gathering pace across the UK, and we think that's because the Kent variant, with the transmission advantage, is winning. So in one sense, the fact that one is worse is actually helping us keep some other variants out, if that makes coherent sense, because the better the transmission, the more likely it is to win the race against its fellow mutations. However, it should warn us that mutations are a consistent problem, and E484 won't be the last one. There will be another one, and there'll be one that escapes this version of the vaccine, or a bit of this version of the vaccine. So we have to keep on top of it. There are two things that help us do that. The first is we have the best genomic investigation numbers and science in the world. I don't think there's any debate about that. Across the UK, we do more genetic testing of this virus than any other. In fact, we have found more of the variants for the rest of the world than the rest of the world has found. And back to importation. Once you get prevalence down and you don't have mutations of your own, the trick is not to bring any more in.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Could I turn next to Stuart McMillan, please?
Thank you, Convener. First question's to the Cabinet Secretary. In your opening comments, you used the phrase of being cautious and phased with regards to the also what we're going to hear next week. And in the media this morning, it's been reported that the UK government appear to be a bit more, for want of a better phrase, gung-ho in terms of where it may be going with a reopening of the economy and society. And I'm not asking you to obviously make us aware of what's going to be in the announcement next week, but in terms of the UK approach, would you see any challenges and risks to Scotland if that particular approach does seem to, it does appear and is rolled out.
Well, I hope we are all mindful, and I think, to be fair, the Prime Minister actually said this yesterday. We're all mindful of the data. It is the data, not dates, that matters on this. And I know everybody, every single person wants to know dates. They want to know, when this will happen, when that will happen. And I fully understand. I want to know that too. And I would be really delighted to know that, but that's not going to happen. It has to be driven by the data. And therefore, as long as we are all being driven by the data, and we are all looking very carefully at the data as it is presented to us, then I'm confident that there will not be a conflict or a difficulty within that. But equally, I'm confident that we will make the decisions in the Cabinet that are right for Scotland. And that's what we've done, and that's what we're going to go on doing. And therefore, we will be cautious, and we do know that this is not a question of, looking at calendar and saying that's the day and that's the day. It's not dominoes falling one after the other. It is very careful steps based upon what we have seen, what we know, and what we are advised, and what we believe will work best. So that, as Jason has indicated, we do not, at any stage, go backwards. We only go forwards. No matter how slowly, we only go forwards.
Well, thank you. Second question is regarding education and the changes from next week, particularly with regarding the P1 to P3, and clearly I know there has been obviously dialogue regarding this concerning that social distancing, because it's difficult for P1 to P3 kids to do such a thing. Were the trade unions, were they fully content with the P1 to P3s going back, and did they raise any particular concerns regarding how that could be managed to certainly protect the children, but also the teachers?
Well, let me pass to Jason in terms of transmission and the differences between the young children and others. I think what you have seen is the outcome of the deliberations of the Educational Recovery Group, of a variety of others, fed through the decision-making process. So I'm not privy to the details of everything that everybody said at any of those meetings or all of those meetings. What I am privy to is the outcome, and what the outcome has been announced, and that's what we're trying to move towards. But Jason might say more about young children and older children, because there are differences, and we recognise those differences.
It was, as I'm sure you can tell, Mr. McMillan, over the last few days and weeks, a very, very finely balanced piece of advice, and then a very finely balanced choice for the Cabinet to make. It isn't clear, so therefore it's difficult, because of the balance between the health and well-being of children and the health of the nation because of COVID-19. And that balance is particularly acute when you bring it down to those small children. We know that even the new variant doesn't transmit well from young children, and young children don't get a serious version of the disease, except in very, very rare cases. And therefore our advice was that young children would be able to come back first, and we would wait 3 weeks before bringing back anybody else, because we want to know what this does to our R number, and we want prevalence to continue to fall in those, what was 4 weeks from the decision point, 3 weeks into that process. The question about the unions, I maybe hand to Sam to be able to answer that. Specifically, the unions are involved in that process. I've spoken to them many times, as has my colleague, who's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Marion Bain, who has led education for us in terms of clinical advice.
Thank you, Professor Leach. So, as the Cabinet Secretary referred to, all of these issues and considerations have been, we've consulted the Education Recovery Group. They met for the 45th time earlier today, so that engagement and consultation has been extensive throughout all of this. As you would expect with a group of that nature, I think there are probably mixed views across the table, but the engagement has been comprehensive. Crucially, the issue regarding physical distancing for all age cohorts, including primary school pupils, has been through our advisory subgroup and clinician advice, and they have been clear and consistent throughout that physical distancing is not required for the younger children. And so we've absolutely based our guidance upon that evidence to make sure we can accommodate in-person learning for as many of those young people as possible.
Thank you. I hope that Stuart, Mr. McMillan, that gives you a comprehensive view of where the issue is.
That does, no. Thank you very much for that. And my final question is actually, it's the last year, a briefing that took place in Parliament where Professor Leach came in, and it was, I think, the first time he came in to make the MSPs aware of the seriousness of COVID. And I remember posing a question to him about messages of hope and trying to get some more positive stories, positive communications out about just to make people aware that we will get through this. Notwithstanding also what's been said today about also regarding Test and Protect and also the vaccination, clearly wasn't here last year where it is now, and also that the issue of the importation of the new strains. Has there been any consideration given to maybe a change of communications at the relevant time to have maybe some more kind of positive stories about people who have recovered and how we can start to potentially maybe change some of the atmosphere within the country?
Well, I mean, I'm very keen that we are accurate and honest with people. And you heard from the Citizens Panel, and I've heard from the Citizens Assembly, and I know you were at the meeting on Monday, and we're debating that this afternoon, that honesty is absolutely vital. Honesty and openness is absolutely vital. We have to tell the truth about the situation, and we have to go on telling the truth. And the First Minister indicated again yesterday, there are grounds for cautious optimism in what we're seeing. We don't know fully what the impact of the vaccination programme will be, but we are cautiously optimistic from what we see and what we understand. The statistics would give us grounds for that cautious optimism. But we really don't want to get into a situation where people think, "Oh, that's it. We can move on to something else." We're far, far from that. And therefore, I understand what you're saying. I think we should be hopeful. I think the First Minister has indicated, for example, in her statement on Tuesday, that whilst we don't think people will be in a position to go away and to use the hospitality industry at Easter, we're hopeful as the summer comes on that there will be changes and we will move in that way. We don't think people should be booking summer holidays because we don't think abroad because we don't think that's going to happen. But there are grounds for optimism. We might be able to move about a bit more as the year goes on. So let's be realistic. Let's be honest. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But of course, we should always be hopeful. This is going to come to an end. That is what we know. This is going to come to an end. But to get it to an end in the shortest possible period of time, we must be ruthlessly honest about it, and we must also make sure we do everything that is required. And that means everything is required by everybody to bring that moment closer.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Our next questions come from Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Convener. Can I first of all say a big thank you to Professor Leach. You worked magic with the Helensburgh Medical Centre and GP practices the other day on stocks for vaccine, and I was able to have my jab yesterday. So thank you very much on behalf of the GPs there. It worked. Right, can I go to my first question? Two of my constituents, both foster carers who share their house with their 78-year-old mother-in-law, feel increasingly concerned as they come into direct contact and engage with social workers, birth parents, and school and healthcare professionals, that despite the greater risk this poses in contracting COVID-19. What would be your response, Cabinet Secretary, and indeed Professor Leach, as you wish, to my constituents' call for all foster carers in Scotland to be included as a priority group to receive the vaccine as part of the phase 2 rollout, given their work is deemed essential?
I would absolutely point to the JCVI advice and to the evidence that Jason Leach has given to this committee on more than one occasion, that this is a risk-based process, and the assessment of risk is done by the JCVI very carefully and very thoughtfully. And whilst I have every sympathy and support for foster carers in these circumstances, that's the right approach. And perhaps, I don't want to speak for Jason, but perhaps Jason will repeat what he said at every time we've discussed this. That is the approach that works, and that is the right investment of time, effort, and resource to get essentially the best result.
Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And Mr. Corrie, and you're very welcome. I did almost nothing. The work is done by those Helensburgh GPs and teams, of course, and the kind of unsung heroes of our procurement and delivery process who are working miracles across the country to get vaccine from Barra to Helensburgh to everywhere else. I just sometimes oil the wheels.
No, much appreciated.
The answer to your question is predictable, and it's about risk. The vaccination programme is based on risk of death, not based on risk of catching the virus. It's quite hard to get that across to individuals. Of course, if we had 9 million doses, we could do it differently. But we don't have 9 million doses. We only have X number of hundreds of thousands of doses, and we'll get 9 million doses. So just now, it is based on risk of death. And the only exception to that is those who are looking after people at risk of death. And that's our health and social care workers. So most foster carers, for whom I have the utmost respect, and I want to keep them as safe as everybody else in our community, the vast majority of foster carers are not looking after people at increased risk of death from the virus. That's the fundamental rule by which we decide who gets vaccinated. Some are, and they will be in the unpaid carer category. They will be in group 6. But apart from them, the group who are foster carers in the round will be vaccinated with the rest of us.
Thank you for that. No, that's fine. I quite understand that, and thank you very much for that. My second question relates to the Merchant Navy, and travel to and from Scotland for our Merchant Navy crews is vital for their continued essential work and employment contracts. Can the Cabinet Secretary, and indeed followed by Professor Leach, confirm that the Scottish Government will continue to comply with the arrangements currently in place as agreed between the United Kingdom Government, the British Chamber of Shipping and the officers and crew unions? Now, these arrangements cover quarantining procedures when they return on leave to the United Kingdom, often from extended tours of duty due to the current COVID pandemic. Would you like to comment on that, and in relation to the quarantining side? Because obviously they hardly see their families during the year. They come back for 4 weeks, and half of it will be spent in a hotel. Now, there are arrangements in place with the organisations I mentioned, Cabinet Secretary. Could you comment on that?
Well, the arrangements in place predate the arrangements that have been put into place for hotel quarantine. So, I'm afraid the arrangements for hotel quarantine supersede those arrangements and are part of the arrangements for the pandemic. There are a list of exemptions which are given on the website. There are exemptions of a variety of types. Some are complete exemptions for urgent work. The example I can think of comes to mind immediately is nuclear power work. And if somebody is needed to go and do something elsewhere and they need to go in and do it and come back out, then there is an exemption in there. Other exemptions apply to where people have come from. There is a list of acute risk, and that is where, and Jason has talked about this, the variants, the most dangerous variants are, and it is necessary to frankly screw down on those as much as possible. Nobody is being asked to do this simply at a whim. They're being asked to do it for a very clear outcome, which is to stop the variants coming in a way that will cause more death and more spread. And that is what we have to consider. Now, everybody every group is looked at its merits. Some groups have been permitted to isolate not in hotel accommodation, and those are listed on the website. But I would just ask people to look at the website, to look at the exemptions, but also to recognise why this is there. And maybe Jason would just like to reflect upon that too, because that is vitally important. It's not designed to inconvenience people or just to say, oh, well, we might as well do this. It is there because we are facing an enormous risk. Jason.
The exemptions have been recently reviewed, and Mr. Matheson is the decision maker in that process, along with his cabinet colleagues. I worry about the exemption list, if I'm honest, because you've heard me say consistently that importation of new virus and new variants is a risk, and exemptions make that more likely. So therefore, exemptions with mitigations has to be the way we do that. That's how Olympic sports people are able to travel around the world. It's how Formula One is able to exist. As those exemptions get a little bit more tricky, then it gets harder to make those choices. If there are only 4 divers in the whole world who can do that particular thing on an oil rig, they should of course be exempt, but they should have mitigations in amongst keeping safe from Norway to Nigeria to Scotland. So the Merchant Navy in the round will not be exempt, but there may be elements in there that will allow it to continue to function in a slightly different way from the rest of the general public. So those exemptions are online. If you need more than that, Mr. Corrie, then I'm absolutely certain Mr. Matheson will be happy to respond to something specific.
Yeah, can I pick you up? Because shipping companies are actually undertaking tests every week on board. And in fact, these people are pretty secure on their ships. In fact, none of them are able to get off their ships, whichever area of the oceans they were operating in. And therefore, when they came back to the UK, they were able to quarantine at home. Now, they've gone through a process of testing negatively, all being well, by the shipping companies, because that's imposed on the shipping companies. They're in a pretty secluded environment on a ship. They're in the open air. And therefore, surely would that not exempt them to be allowed to quarantine at home? At least they see their family for a couple of weeks?
I don't know the actual exemption, so we'll have to look and get back to you. But what you describe sounds relatively secure, not foolproof, but relatively secure. And if that works up to a point, but there have been outbreaks on freighters, there have been outbreaks in the merchant. So it's not quite as simple as because they're doing this will happen. But the exemption list includes advice on exactly those processes. If it's not clear enough, again, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Maurice. Our next questions come from Willie Coffey. Willie.
Thanks very much, Convener. A couple of questions, probably for Jason, I think. Jason, East Ayrshire, you mentioned East Ayrshire's numbers at the start there being over 300, and there's a bit of confusion down here, I have to say. The numbers were being attributed to an outbreak at Bowhouse Prison, which is just outside Kilmarnock. It's just outside Hurlford, in fact. But the Public Health Scotland data shows the data spike occurring nowhere near where the prison is. It's in a data zone that's inside the town's centre. So I was wondering if you could help us clarify which it is, whether it's the Bowhouse that's causing the spike or it's not, because I've had a lot of constituents asking if we could possibly clarify that.
I don't know for sure, Mr. Coffey, but I think it's both. And I think, remember, workplaces are not hermetically sealed. And a lot of people who work in a workplace live locally, whether it's a school or a call centre or a prison. So I think what we're seeing is some community transmission from a workplace outbreak. And we're also seeing the workplace outbreak brought in from the community. And that could be the chicken factory in Cooper Angus, it could be the call centre in Lanarkshire all those months ago, or it could be a recent prison outbreak, of which there have been a couple. It's being very well managed. I've been in touch with the outbreak management teams, with the incident management teams in Ayrshire. It's very difficult because of the nature of that environment, but it's being well managed both by the prison staff and by the public health staff. But the reality is, when you get to those kind of numbers, you get to community transmission pretty easily, and therefore we need that community to pay particular attention to its interactions, to following the safety measures, to all of those other things, and get those numbers down, which I'm confident they can do. They've done it before, but they just have to be super careful.
The prisoners themselves, though, clearly are in the prison. But the data from Public Health Scotland doesn't seem to show any spike in that data zone where the prison actually is. That's why people find this hard to understand.
So there are cases in the prison. So that's something I'll have to take away with Public Health Scotland. That may be a nuance of the postcode of the prison, or maybe it's in the wrong data. So I'm very happy to look into that with Public Health Scotland and see if the representation of that data is 100% accurate in terms of location.
Yeah, I'd really be obliged for that, because it's causing quite a bit of concern and confusion down here. I wanted to ask you another question that is following on from John Mason's questions about treatments, but I was thinking about long-term COVID conditions again, Jason, and I get a number of constituents reporting to me that they're exhibiting this, that or the next condition and so on. Is there any research or any work going on to gather intelligence about what these conditions are? And I'm thinking also about people that might not even be aware that they had COVID, but they then go on to develop some kinds of conditions or other. Are we doing anything to try to gather intelligence on this, see what the picture looks like, and to see what treatments might be appropriate?
We are, both globally, the WHO, but also more locally in Scotland and across the UK. For the first time, the NICE, which doesn't have power in Scotland, but does England and Wales, SIGN, which is our version of guidelines in Scotland, and the Royal College of GPs, 4 nations, have come together and written a guideline, but not a once-in-a-moment guideline, a guideline that is continuing to develop on post-COVID syndrome, or long COVID for short, and it contains exactly what you described. What are the symptoms? What are the most common things? Which age groups? Which genders? Etc., etc. And it is, of course, gathering information all the time because we haven't had the disease for long. So it's getting to the bottom of what that is. It's being used by clinical teams to make decisions, to make referral choices. So people are coming with things we expected, like cardiac disease, because post-viral cardiac disease is a thing, and we recognise it. Post-viral respiratory disease is a thing. But people are also coming with occasional neurological challenges or mental illness or other things. So it's all wrapped together. It's quite hard to get through some of the opacity of it because it's generalised symptoms. It's not something you can just check with a blood test. It gets to the heart of medicine where it gets a bit more tricky. And GPs are getting that guidance, and healthcare upstream, so the hospitals are also getting that guidance. And I think we'll learn more and more as time passes.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned one of the treatments earlier in response to John Mason. Is that the only one that we know of at the moment, or are there any others in the pipeline that give us some hope?
There are no confirmed treatments for post-COVID syndrome other than for the individual elements of post-COVID syndrome. So if you have a cardiac response because you've been in intensive care for a prolonged period or you have a respiratory, then we can treat those things. But there is no recognised treatment in the round for post-COVID syndrome. I'm not entirely sure there ever will be because of the nature of what it is. The treatment we really need is upstream. It's the kind of, if I get COVID, what should I do? Should I take something quick? Should I take antivirals? Should we invent a new antiviral? Something in there that will stop the disease progressing to serious illness and potentially stop people getting what is becoming a chronic disease post-COVID.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That really helps. Thank you. Back to you, convener.
Thanks, Willie. Our final set of questions come from Annabel Ewing. Annabel.
Thank you, convener. Good afternoon to the Cabinet Secretary and to Professor Leach. I've got 3 areas of questioning. First, on the international travel issue. Second, the current state of play vis-à-vis the manufacturer's slowdown in supply. And third, a few pick-up questions for the Professor on a few constituent queries about the treatment of individual conditions on the priority list. First, travel. I've asked this before, but it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary could provide an update as to where discussions currently stand as between the Scottish Government on the I'd like to see being adopted across the UK, failing which at least some system being put in place to ensure that the policy that we have decided is the best one, i.e. a comprehensive approach, is not undermined by policies decided elsewhere.
Yes, I think that Mr Matheson has made it very clear to the UK government that we believe the correct way forward is the policy that we have put forward. There appear to be mixed messages on that from the UK government. I think Matt Hancock indicated that he wasn't unsympathetic to discussing these. I think others have indicated a reluctance even to enter into discussion of them. Those discussions continue. I think Mr Matheson is a person to update the committee on that, and if the committee wants an update from him, I think they should ask him for it. I think it's very important that we continue to argue for what we believe to be right. I think we then have to see how that plays out in the next few days.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and just picking up on the importance of having a comprehensive approach. I understand that the 3 cases in New Zealand, the positive cases, were one family member worked in a laundry and the laundered materials from international flights. And I would like Professor Leach to comment on that, because if that is the case, and perhaps he's got more up-to-date intelligence on the matter, surely that is a very serious matter and surely must make us all reflect on the transmissibility of this virus. Thank you, Professor Leach.
I don't know the detail of the specific 3 people. I know the virus is easy to catch, but I also know it's relatively easy to avoid. And if you follow the safety measures, you can go a long way to avoiding catching the virus. But it is around, and you should be very, very careful. Importation, I've said many times here, is absolutely crucial. It's actually not quite as important when you've got 1,000 cases a day as it will be when we get down to much lower numbers, when the slope is towards us rather than away from us. Just now we are exporting, not importing. But once we get low, it will become absolutely crucial that we don't seed the virus. Now, what New Zealand have also demonstrated is how to do test and protect, their version test and trace in their country, to find those 3 cases, backwards trace where they came from, isolate the chains of transmission, but they also locked down Auckland for 5 days in order to do that. So there are societal choices in there that aren't mine, that are about all of us and about the government of the day making some choices about what we can open and what the cost of that opening is if we want to get back to more domestic normality. We're not New Zealand, and I'm not naive enough to think we can do it as New Zealand, and nor should we. But there is some ground there that we should learn from last summer, as I've said many times, where we should be better at that this time around.
I thank Professor Leach for that answer, and I think it will be something to watch, to see very carefully the upshot of the review that the New Zealand authorities will be conducting on that matter, and I guess leave it there until we get all the facts. Indeed, the look at international best practice was an issue we discussed in the earlier session this morning with the Citizens Panel, and I note that it is something that they were very keen that we look at international best practice, recognising, of course, that not all examples will be directly analogous, but nonetheless that we should look and listen and learn. Second area of questioning, start with CAPSEC, if I may. We have heard, and we heard from the Cabinet Secretary for Health last week, the issue of the supply slowdown on the part of the manufacturers, both Pfizer and AstraZeneca, for different reasons. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that this actually is a matter that impacts across the UK and not just Scotland? And second, is there any update on where matters stand with regard to that? Thank you.
Well, I understand it does affect the whole of the UK, and indeed we've seen in other countries it affects their programmes too. Pfizer has been reorganising its manufacturing capability, but quite clearly there is a commitment that the total to be received will remain the same, but the phasing has changed, and that is what we're presently coping with. And we're also, of course, in the position, and it's very logical we would be in this position, where now we need to put ourselves in the position of being able to do second doses, and that comes on stream if you look at the timescale before too long, and therefore there has to be some that has to enter into the programme, and therefore the first doses will reduce. Jason might have more up-to-date information. I think the First Minister indicated that she had spoken to AstraZeneca earlier this week, and I think that dialogue is ongoing. And I think we should just make sure that dialogue continues.
So there's good news and more challenging news in there, but there isn't actually that much of a surprise. We've always known, or not always known, we've known for a number of weeks that the 2 weeks now we're going to see a limit in supply in order for us to get the order that was promised in the timescale that was promised. So the end point is still the same, and we've no reason to believe that will change. Of course, there are things we cannot predict, but both Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and then the others that are coming on board, are promising their supply will remain intact. But lumpy is the best way to describe it. It comes in lumps, and therefore this couple of weeks, and then there's another week in March where they're doing something else, where the numbers fall. I can confirm that is all 4 UK countries. We get 8.2% of everything that arrives when it arrives. So it's across the board. Some countries are a little bit behind us, some are a little bit ahead of us. So working it out, we're doing about 30,000, 32, 34,000 a day. This week, we managed to do nearly 60,000 a couple of days last week. Some are doing a little bit less, a little bit more, but we're all heading to the same place at the end of this month and then into May.
I thank Professor Leach for that update, and I've got another few questions on more general issues to do with categories, and just perhaps when Professor Leach is answering my last series of questions here, convener, he could just return to the issue to confirm, which I think the FM confirmed again on Tuesday of this week, that for those who have had their first dose of either vaccine, their second dose timetable is not impacted by the current vaccine manufacturer supply issues. I think that would be helpful for all our constituents, because I know I certainly get emails about that. But lastly, I've had a constituent contact me who has asthma and was concerned to note developments south of the border in terms of categorisation of asthma sufferers. And I just wonder if the Professor could indicate where asthma sufferers stand in Scotland in terms of priority vaccination, and of course taking into account that even if an asthma sufferer does not have what's called severe or chronic asthma, they may nonetheless be at risk in terms of long COVID issues. And secondly, a constituent who has cerebral palsy who requires to have care 7 days a week would wish to know where they stand in terms of getting a vaccine, not least because they are having excellent carers come in every day of the week, but different carers coming from different households, and they are concerned about their exposure. Thank you, Professor.
So quickly, I can confirm timescales for the 12 weeks are intact. We anticipate our modelling to deal with the supply issues, and people will get their vaccine within that 12 weeks. Don't be too concerned if it's 12 weeks and 2 days, or 11 weeks, or 10 and a half weeks. The most recent research says that extending the time to 12 weeks actually gives you better immune response and was the right choice for the Joint Committee. But it doesn't suddenly stop working if you get it on 12 weeks and a day. Asthma is in group 6, but only if you have what the Joint Committee call more severe asthma. So that is if you are on oral steroids regularly and or you've had an admission for asthma. It is not for well-controlled inhaler type asthma. That's a disappointment for a number of people, I understand, but let me go back to the evidence from earlier. Vaccination is about risk of death, not about risk of catching the virus. It's about risk of death from the virus. And therefore you work your way down that risk curve, and some asthmatics are in that group and some asthmatics are not. Cerebral palsy isn't in one category inside that list. It depends on the individual and the circumstances of that individual, the seriousness of the disease, the other underlying conditions of the disease. So that will be a matter for their individual care team. Some people with cerebral palsy are already vaccinated because they were in the shielding group, the clinically extremely vulnerable group. Some will be done in the vulnerable group, the group 6, and some will be done when we reach their age group.
Okay, and one last brief supplementary, if I may, Professor, on the issue of the asthmatic. So is it the GP that decides, and the same with the person with cerebral palsy? Is it they go to their GP? Because one of them certainly has been trying to find an answer and been given the runaround, quite frankly, between helplines and this number, that number, this website, all seeming to go back round in a circle and getting absolutely nowhere. Do they go to their GP? Where do they go to get this decision made?
They don't do anything yet. We're not at group 6 yet. So group 6 is very complex and hugely difficult because it's the first where we're having to make decisions about clinical choice, exactly as you describe. And it also includes, remember, we're about to do all the unpaid carers. So we have to have access for people to self-allocate themselves, etc., etc. So there will be a series of steps that people will then have to go through in order to get themselves into that process. And that will be made clear just as soon as we bottom out exactly what it will look like. It will, of course, include GPs. In some places, it will be national booking systems. But for now, we haven't started group 6. So people just need to take a breath, give us a little bit more time, but we're getting there.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you for that. That concludes our consideration of this agenda item, and can I thank both the Cabinet Secretary and the National Clinical Director and Mr. Anson for their attendance this morning. I should also say that very grateful to Professor Leach for attending the Citizens Panel. I know he was one of the experts who spoke to that panel last month. We now turn to agenda item 3, that is subordinate legislation. And consideration of the motion on the subordinate legislation that we've just taken evidence on. Cabinet Secretary, would you like to make any further remarks on the SSI before we take the motion?
No, I have nothing further to say. Thank you.
I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to move motion S5M 24115 that the COVID-19 Committee recommends that the Personal Protective Equipment Temporary Arrangements Coronavirus Scotland Regulations 2021 SSI 2021/50 be approved.
Moved.
Does any member wish to speak on the motion? If so, could you please indicate this by typing R in the chat bar now. It appears that no member wishes to speak on the motion, so I will now put the question on the motion. The question is that motion S5M 24115 be agreed to. Does any member disagree? And if so, please type N in the chat bar now. No member has indicated they disagree, so the motion is agreed to. The committee will publish a report to the Parliament setting out our decision on the statutory instrument considered at this meeting in due course, and that concludes our consideration of this agenda item and our time with the Cabinet Secretary. Can I thank him again and all his officials for their attendance this morning. That concludes our business for this meeting. The next committee meeting will take place on Thursday, the 25th of February, and the clerks will update members on the arrangement for that meeting in due course. Can I now close the meeting? Thank you.